Kathleen Dorsett. Kathleen Dorsett, born July 2, 1974, worked as a Neptune, New Jersey schoolteacher at Gables School, where she instructed kindergarten and third-grade students and built a reputation as an educator dedicated to her young students. She married Stephen Moore, a Honda dealership salesman and former speed skater, in 2007. Their daughter Elizabeth was born in 2008, but the marriage quickly deteriorated under the weight of ongoing conflicts and disagreements. By June 2010, the couple divorced, with Dorsett gaining primary custody of Elizabeth. However, the court imposed restrictions preventing her from relocating to Florida with her parents, Thomas and Leslie Dorsett. The family had desperately hoped to make a fresh start in Florida, away from New Jersey and the complications of the divorce. Court-mandated support and visitation rights meant Moore would remain a constant presence in their lives, creating ongoing frustration and resentment that would eventually spiral into something far more sinister. On August 16, 2010, Moore arrived at the Oakhurst home to drop off Elizabeth after a scheduled visit. Dorsett lured him to the backyard under the seemingly innocent pretense of retrieving tools from the shed. What Moore did not realize was that Thomas Dorsett was waiting in ambush, ready to attack. In a brutal assault, Thomas bludgeoned and strangled Moore to death, while Kathleen strategically positioned herself to shield the horrific scene from any neighbors who might happen to look toward the backyard. Once Moore was deceased, Kathleen helped her father load the body into a car trunk, then assisted in meticulously cleaning up the backyard to remove any trace of blood or other evidence that might link them to what had occurred. The body was placed inside Moore's mother's 2001 Nissan Altima, and the family believed they could destroy all evidence through fire. 2 days after the attack, Thomas drove the vehicle to Long Branch and set it ablaze, hoping to eliminate any forensic evidence that might tie them to Moore's disappearance. Thomas had initially paid acquaintance Anthony Morris $3,000 to commit the arson, though when Morris hesitated about actually carrying out the act, Thomas ultimately did it himself, driving the car to its final location and setting it on fire. The plan began to unravel rapidly when Moore's employer at the Honda dealership reported him missing after he failed to appear for work on Monday morning. Investigators discovered the burned vehicle with Moore's charred remains still inside, and the suspicious circumstances immediately raised red flags for detectives. Forensic investigators meticulously examined the Dorsett backyard and found blood evidence in the mulch, which proved crucial in establishing what had actually happened on that August day. On August 23, 2010, just 1 week after Moore's death, authorities arrested Kathleen, Thomas, and Leslie Dorsett on murder-related charges. In May 2013, facing overwhelming evidence on multiple fronts, all parties entered guilty pleas. Dorsett prepared a formal statement admitting her role in luring Moore to his death and participating in the cover-up. On August 8, 2013, Judge Richard W. Malassi handed down the sentences during an emotional courtroom proceeding. Dorsett received 58 years in prison, 30 years for accomplice liability and murder, 8 consecutive years for conspiracy to desecrate remains, and 20 consecutive years for the attempted contract killing of Evelyn Moore. Under the No Early Release Act, she must serve 47 years before any parole eligibility. Thomas received 45 years, combining 30 for the murder with 15 for arson. Leslie was sentenced to 7 years for conspiracy, while Morris received 7 years for his role in the desecration conspiracy. The next case involved modern technology and plotting harm. Jacqueline Diorio. Jacqueline Diorio, a 26-year-old hairstylist from Runnymede, New Jersey, found herself facing extraordinarily serious criminal charges in April 2025 for a murder-for-hire scheme that seemed pulled directly from a crime thriller, but was all too real. She had recently ended a tumultuous relationship with a 57-year-old Philadelphia police officer, and the breakup left her consumed with thoughts of revenge that would eventually escalate into a carefully planned conspiracy. The breakup occurred on March 6, 2025. Following a turbulent period in their relationship that had been marked by mutual restraining orders, though both parties had eventually dropped those legal protections, suggesting perhaps they believed they could move past their conflicts. Rather than accepting the end of the relationship and attempting to move forward with her life, Diorio turned to the dating app Tinder. But her purpose in using the platform was not romantic in any sense. She was actively searching for someone willing to carry out an unthinkable act on her behalf. Through Tinder, Diorio connected with someone she believed could help her carry out her revenge plan. The exchanges took place from March 31st to April 3rd, 2025, during which she worked to establish the arrangement. She proposed paying $12,000 total to have both the officer and his 19-year-old daughter eliminated. She offered $500 as an initial down payment, with a substantial remainder to be paid upon completion of both acts. Her reasoning for including the daughter in the plot was particularly calculated and cold-blooded, demonstrating premeditation. Diorio believed that if only the officer met with misfortune, suspicion would naturally and immediately fall on her as the recent ex-partner who had a documented history of conflict with him. By targeting the daughter as well, she hoped to make the incidents appear completely random or unrelated to their past relationship, thereby deflecting any investigation away from herself and creating the appearance of a senseless tragedy that could not be traced back to her. What Diorio did not realize in her planning was that the person she had contacted through Tinder was actually a confidential informant already working with law enforcement. Every conversation, every detail of the arrangement was being carefully documented and recorded by authorities who were building a comprehensive case against her. The informant gathered extensive evidence of Diorio's intentions over multiple days of communication, including specific discussions about payment amounts, timing for when the acts should occur, and precise details about how they should be carried out. A recorded phone call captured her confirming her intent, with her asking, "Why the fuck would I want out?" when discussing the plot, demonstrating her commitment to seeing it through. This was not the first time Diorio's actions toward the officer had drawn serious law enforcement attention or raised concerns about his safety. In 2022, someone had thrown a Molotov cocktail at his residence, a dangerous incident that raised serious red flags even then about potential threats. While no charges were filed at that time due to lack of evidence linking anyone specifically to the incident, the Molotov cocktail attack became highly relevant context when investigators examined the more recent murder-for-hire plot and looked at Diorio's documented history of conflict with the officer. Authorities moved quickly and decisively once they had sufficient evidence of the conspiracy. On April 4th, 2025, Diorio paid the $500 down payment in a Glendora Dollar General parking lot, believing she was taking the first concrete step toward her revenge. Police arrested her at the scene while she sat in her white Honda Civic, catching her in the act of attempting to hire someone for murder. Investigators found alprazolam pills during the arrest, adding drug charges to her already serious situation. She was charged with 2 counts of first-degree attempted murder, 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder, and third-degree unlawful possession of controlled substances. Diorio's case remains in the pre-trial phase as of late 2025. The following case involved far more direct and brutal methods. Rita Gluzman. Rita Gluzman, born in 1948 in Ukraine, and her husband Yakov Gluzman arrived in the United States in 1971, both fleeing the persecution they had faced as Jews living in the Soviet Union. The couple worked incredibly hard to build new lives in New Jersey, leaving behind the hardships, discrimination, and dangers they had endured in their homeland. Rita worked as a women's rights activist, advocating for causes she believed in, while Yakov became a highly successful cancer researcher conducting important work. They co-owned ECI technology together, building a business partnership alongside their marriage. And their son, Elon, was born in 1972, completing what appeared to be a successful American dream story. However, by the mid-1990s, their marriage had deteriorated completely beyond any hope of repair or reconciliation. Divorce proceedings began in 1995, with Yakov alleging instances of mistreatment during their marriage and Rita claiming he was having an affair with a colleague at the laboratory where he worked. For Rita, the prospect of divorce triggered intense anxiety and mounting fears about dividing the substantial assets they had accumulated over their years together and losing the financial security and comfortable lifestyle she had known. Friends and family members later recalled that Rita became increasingly obsessed with the divorce proceedings, fixating constantly on what she stood to lose in terms of property, money, business interests, and the lifestyle she had built. On April 6, 1996, Rita made her calculated and brutal move. She recruited her cousin Vladimir Zelenin to help with what would become a horrific crime, convincing him to participate by playing on his own vulnerabilities and fears about potential job loss and immigration issues. The two made a deliberate trip to a Home Depot store where they purchased tools, including an axe, hatchet, and hacksaw, items specifically chosen for what they intended to do. They then traveled together to Yakov's Pearl River, New York apartment, where he lived alone following the separation. What happened next was discovered only when investigators began piecing together the gruesome physical evidence left behind. Yakov, who was 48 years old at the time, was attacked with an axe and hatchet, struck repeatedly with such extreme force and violence that he had absolutely no chance of survival. Rita and Zelenin then proceeded to dismember his body using the hacksaw they had purchased, attempting to eliminate any traces of their horrific crime and make identification more difficult should the remains be discovered. The conspirators placed Yakov's dismembered remains in multiple garbage bags and attempted to dispose of them permanently in different locations. However, their plan failed catastrophically. Zelenin was arrested while attempting to dump body parts in New Jersey's Passaic River, caught in the act by law enforcement. Rita was found breaking into a cabin on Long Island, where she had stolen license plates and was preparing elaborate escape plans, demonstrating consciousness of guilt and intent to flee justice. Investigators found substantial evidence linking Rita directly to the crime scene at the Pearl River apartment. Forensic analysis revealed extensive traces of Yakov's blood throughout the apartment in locations, patterns, and quantities that contradicted any innocent explanation Rita might possibly offer. The blood spatter evidence told an unmistakable story of brutal attack followed by methodical dismemberment. Zelenin, facing intense questioning and the overwhelming weight of the physical evidence, eventually cooperated with authorities and provided detailed testimony about Rita's central role in both planning and executing the vicious attack on Yakov, in exchange for a plea deal that would reduce his own sentence. In a historically significant outcome that would set legal precedent, Rita Glusman became the first woman ever convicted under the Violence Against Women Act for interstate domestic violence, marking a milestone in federal prosecution of such cases. On April 30th, 1997, she was sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Her appeal was subsequently denied by higher courts, affirming both the conviction and the sentence. For over 2 decades, Glusman remained incarcerated in federal facilities, serving her life sentence. Then, in a controversial decision, on July 28, 2020, at age 79, Glusman was granted compassionate release due to serious health concerns, including multiple strokes and Parkinson's disease that made continued incarceration potentially life-threatening. Upon release, Glusman was placed under supervised conditions in Hackensack, New Jersey, with 5 years of supervision and monitoring. She remained subject to ongoing monitoring, strict restrictions on her activities and movements, and regular check-ins with authorities. What drives someone to plan not one loss of life, but multiple acts for financial gain? Celestine Payne. Celestine Payne, now 74 years old, presented herself as a caring and trustworthy figure to those in her community. But beneath that carefully constructed exterior lay something far more sinister and calculated. Over the course of several years during the 1990s, Payne orchestrated multiple elaborate schemes specifically designed to collect substantial insurance money, showing complete disregard for the devastating human cost involved in her plans and treating human lives as mere obstacles to financial gain. Payne's pattern of calculated destruction began with her first victim, her own husband. In 1991, she poisoned her husband Alfonso, carefully selecting substances and methods to collect $39,000 in insurance money. She enlisted her own offspring to help dump the body, demonstrating her willingness to involve family members in her schemes and corrupt them in the process. The method she chose allowed her to avoid immediate suspicion from family members, friends, neighbors, and medical professionals who might otherwise have questioned the circumstances of his sudden passing. This initial success only emboldened her, demonstrating that her carefully constructed plans could work and that she possessed the cold calculation necessary to avoid detection while benefiting financially. But Payne's greed and callousness did not stop with her husband's insurance payout. In 1993, she turned her attention to a tenant named Eugene Cooper, someone who trusted her and relied on her as a landlord. She fabricated claims to create a motive and justification, then attacked him when he was vulnerable. After the attack left him critically injured, she callously posed as his mother and signed a do not resuscitate order, ensuring he would not receive the life-saving treatment that might have saved him, effectively sealing his fate through deliberate medical neglect. In 1995, Payne committed what prosecutors would later describe as her most heinous and depraved act. She next turned her attention to someone significantly younger and far more vulnerable than her previous victims. She targeted someone the court documents refer to carefully, without unnecessary detail. Payne attacked and harmed this person after fraudulently taking out a $25,000 insurance policy, making her mercenary motivation crystal clear to investigators once they began examining the disturbing pattern of losses and insurance payouts surrounding her. What finally drew the serious and sustained attention of law enforcement authorities was the sheer statistical improbability and highly suspicious nature of Payne's circumstances. The body was discovered by joggers in a location, which launched an intensive investigation that would eventually unravel the entire series of plots spanning multiple years. Multiple people in her immediate circle had passed away under highly questionable or unusual circumstances, and each time without fail, Payne stood to benefit financially through insurance payouts that she had carefully and deliberately arranged in advance. The pattern was simply too obvious, too consistent, and too beneficial to Payne to ignore as mere tragic coincidence. Detectives began methodically reviewing all the cases with fresh eyes and renewed scrutiny, looking for connections and evidence that might have been missed or overlooked during the initial investigations, when each incident was treated as an isolated tragedy, rather than part of a larger pattern. Investigators found clear traces of poison in carefully preserved tissue samples from her husband, substances that had absolutely no legitimate medical reason to be present in his system at the significant levels that were detected. The specific poisons found were sufficient to cause serious harm and were inconsistent with any prescribed medications or treatments he had been receiving. Medical examiners carefully and thoroughly reevaluated all the circumstances surrounding his passing and concluded definitively that his demise had been deliberately caused through intentional poisoning, not through any natural medical condition or accidental exposure. In 1997, facing overwhelming evidence on multiple counts, Payne entered guilty pleas to 2 counts of murder, along with attempted murder and other related charges, acknowledging her responsibility for the losses. She received 2 concurrent life terms with 30 years of parole ineligibility, plus 20 consecutive years, ensuring she would remain behind bars for decades to come. In January 2025, Payne's legal team filed for compassionate release, arguing that she had served sufficient time, posed no ongoing threat to society given her advanced age and health conditions, and deserved mercy. However, the New Jersey Supreme Court firmly and unequivocally denied this request. Payne became eligible for regular parole consideration in March 2025 after serving the minimum required time. But she remains imprisoned with no realistic prospect of ever being released, given the severity of her crimes and the strong opposition from victims' families and prosecutors. The following case involved disputes over property and inheritance turning catastrophic. Sherry Lee Heffernan. Sherry Lee Heffernan, 57 years old and from Pennsylvania, had long harbored deep and festering resentment about her father's financial decisions and what she viewed as her rightful inheritance being threatened by circumstances beyond her control. The central dispute centered on valuable property he owned, and specifically a $1.9 million home sale that would exclude her from receiving what she believed she deserved from his will, representing an enormous sum that Heffernan felt entitled to receive as his daughter and heir. Heffernan's father, John Enders, who was 87 years old, had lived in Surf City, New Jersey for many years and had built a comfortable life for himself in his retirement years. He had been in a committed and loving relationship with Françoise Pitoy, who was 75 years old, and the couple shared their lives and their Surf City home together, building a partnership that brought them both happiness and companionship in their later years. Enders had made it absolutely clear to his daughter that he intended to make all decisions about his property, finances, and estate planning independently, without requiring or even seeking his adult daughter's approval, input, or consent. This autonomy and independence infuriated Heffernan, who felt strongly entitled to have a significant say in matters she viewed as directly affecting her eventual inheritance and financial future. The simmering conflict reached a violent and deadly breaking point on September 29, 2021. A day that would forever change multiple families. On a day that had started normally for the elderly couple, Heffernan arrived at her father's Surf City residence without warning or announcement, determined to resolve the inheritance dispute in her own brutal way. What happened next was an attack of shocking and sustained brutality that demonstrated extreme rage. She stabbed her father, John Enders, 51 times, and Françoise Pitoy, 39 times, using a sharp knife to inflict dozens upon dozens of deep wounds on each victim as they desperately tried to defend themselves, escape, or call for help. When the prolonged and vicious stabbing alone did not achieve her objective quickly enough, and the elderly victims were still showing signs of life and attempting to reach safety or a telephone, she retrieved a firearm and shot both individuals in the face at close range, ensuring they could not possibly survive to identify her as their attacker or seek emergency assistance from neighbors, medical services, or law enforcement. The scene that investigators encountered when they arrived was one of extreme and disturbing distress that affected even experienced detectives. Blood evidence was found throughout multiple rooms of the residence, telling a horrific story of what had transpired and showing that the elderly victims had attempted to escape, hide, or defend themselves during the prolonged and vicious attack that claimed their lives. Bloody footprints led from the location where the main attacks occurred throughout the house, providing crucial forensic evidence that would later prove essential in tying Heffernan definitively to the crime scene. The medical examiner's careful and thorough autopsy determined that both victims had suffered numerous stab wounds to vital areas of their bodies before being shot at close range in the face, indicating a sustained, determined, and rage-filled attack, rather than any momentary loss of control or impulsive action. Law enforcement built their case utilizing multiple forms of evidence, including surveillance footage of her recreational vehicle, cell phone location data that placed her at the scene, bloody footprints that matched her shoes, and ammunition that matched what was used in the attacks. Family members and friends informed detectives about the ongoing, increasingly heated disputes over property, inheritance, and finances, providing investigators with clear and compelling motive for the brutal attacks that had claimed 2 elderly lives. When forensic analysts carefully examined the bloody footprints found throughout the crime scene, they were able to match them definitively to shoes belonging to Heffernan, creating an undeniable physical link between her and the murders that would be impossible to explain away. During extensive questioning by experienced detectives, Heffernan offered multiple varying and contradictory accounts of her exact whereabouts and activities at the time of the incidents. Her stories contain numerous inconsistencies, impossible timelines, and logical problems that investigators carefully documented and preserved for use at trial. After a 4-week jury trial that presented extensive evidence, prosecutors charged Heffernan with 2 counts of first-degree murder, along with multiple weapons-related charges for the use of both the knife and the firearm in commission of the attacks. On March 1, 2024, after careful deliberation, the jury found Heffernan guilty on absolutely all counts, rejecting her defense and finding that the evidence proved her guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. Heffernan remains imprisoned at Edna Mahan Correctional Facility, where she will spend every remaining day of her natural life behind bars, serving as a permanent consequence for the tragedy she brought upon her own family. But can someone's mind become so fractured that reality itself completely shifts? Naomi Elkins. Naomi Elkins, 27 years old at the time of the incident, appeared to neighbors, friends, and community members to be a devoted and loving mother living in Lakewood, New Jersey, a close-knit community where she seemed to be raising her young daughters with ordinary maternal attention and care. She cared for her young daughters with what outwardly seemed like normal parental affection and dedication, managing the daily routines, challenges, and joys that naturally come with raising small individuals. However, beneath this carefully maintained surface appearance of normalcy and typical family life, Elkins was experiencing profound and dangerous psychological changes that would eventually lead to an unspeakable and devastating tragedy that would forever alter and destroy multiple lives in ways that could never be undone, repaired, or fully comprehended. In the months and weeks leading up to the horrific incident that would shock the Lakewood community and capture national attention, Elkins had begun experiencing what mental health professionals and forensic psychiatrists would later clinically describe as a severe psychotic break from reality. Her thoughts, perceptions, and beliefs became increasingly dominated by extreme religious interpretations and convictions that deviated sharply, dramatically, and dangerously from any mainstream understanding or accepted theological doctrine within her faith community. She gradually began to believe with absolute and unshakable certainty that she was receiving specific instructions and direct divine messages and commands, supernatural communications that she believed required her to eradicate evil, and that she was descended from the Messiah, demonstrating how completely and totally her grip on reality had been lost to psychosis. On June 25, 2024, Elkins took actions that would forever alter, devastate, and destroy multiple lives in ways that could never be undone or repaired. In the family bathroom, acting under the complete and total control of her psychotic delusions and religious hallucinations that had overtaken her mind, she drowned her 2 young daughters in the bathtub. She also stabbed the younger daughter, adding to the horror of what occurred. After the acts were complete, she called police and admitted she had counted to 50 while holding them underwater, demonstrating some level of awareness of her actions even within her psychotic state, though she believed she was acting righteously. The scene that investigators and emergency responders discovered when they arrived was one of profound, heartbreaking, and incomprehensible tragedy, with both young victims found deceased in circumstances that left absolutely no doubt whatsoever about what had occurred in that bathroom and who had been responsible. Emergency responders and police officers arrived to find Elkins in a state of complete psychological detachment, dissociation, and disconnection from reality, seemingly unaware of, unable to comprehend, or incapable of processing the true magnitude, horror, and permanence of what had just transpired. The intensive, thorough, and emotionally difficult investigation that followed focused heavily and necessarily on understanding, documenting, and evaluating Elkins' precise mental state, psychological condition, and grip on reality at the exact time of the tragic incident. Experienced detectives conducted extensive, detailed interviews with family members, close friends, neighbors, and religious community members who knew the family well and had observed Elkins in the months leading up to the tragedy. A disturbing, troubling pattern gradually emerged from these interviews of increasingly unusual, erratic, bizarre, and deeply concerning behavior, statements, and beliefs. Multiple forensic psychiatrists and mental health experts were brought in by both the prosecution and defense to conduct extensive, thorough, and professional evaluations of Elkins' mental state and legal culpability. Their independent findings and professional opinions were remarkably consistent. At the precise time of the acts, Elkins had been experiencing a complete and total break from any recognizable, shared, or objective reality. The psychiatrists formally, clinically diagnosed her with severe psychosis that was accompanied by profound, all-encompassing religious delusions. One psychologist provided expert testimony that Elkins was undoubtedly psychotic at the time. Elkins herself stated in a letter, "I put me before my kids," showing some awareness. When the highly anticipated and emotionally charged case finally went to trial, the central legal question before the jury was whether Elkins could reasonably, fairly, and legally be held criminally responsible for her actions given her profoundly impaired mental state. The defense team presented extensive psychiatric testimony demonstrating that Elkins had been incapable of understanding wrongfulness. Multiple independent experts testified that her psychosis was so profound, she effectively existed in an alternate reality. Prosecutors acknowledged the substantial mental health evidence, but initially argued that Elkins should still be held legally accountable. However, the psychiatric experts persuasively countered that even behaviors appearing planned can occur within a severe psychotic state. After lengthy deliberation, on April 3, 2025, the jury returned their unanimous verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity. This verdict did not mean Elkins would simply walk free. Instead, the court committed her indefinitely to a secure psychiatric hospital facility for the equivalent of 150 years, ensuring she would remain under secure care while receiving treatment. She receives ongoing intensive treatment for her persistent psychotic disorder. However, given the extreme severity of what occurred, Mental health professionals anticipate she will require secure hospitalization for the foreseeable future. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. From mental fracture to calculated cruelty, the remaining cases reveal an even darker spectrum. Ruth DiRienzo Whitehead. Ruth DiRienzo Whitehead, 51 years old and from Horsham, Pennsylvania, faced mounting financial pressures that she blamed on her husband. The stress of their deteriorating financial situation consumed her thoughts, and she became increasingly fixated on the perceived injustices she believed her husband had caused through his business decisions and spending habits. On April 10, 2023, DiRienzo Whitehead took actions that would shock investigators and prosecutors. She strangled her son using a belt, carrying out the act with determination. After the attack, she drove her SUV to the New Jersey shore, where she attempted to submerge the vehicle in the ocean at Wildwood Crest. Law enforcement arrested her at the scene in Wildwood Crest, and the investigation quickly revealed disturbing details. Investigators discovered that DiRienzo Whitehead had conducted internet searches on strangulation methods, demonstrating premeditation. She had also researched mental illnesses that cause filicide, suggesting she was considering how to frame her actions. The digital evidence painted a clear picture of planning rather than spontaneous action driven by mental breakdown. During the investigation and trial, DiRienzo Whitehead claimed she had experienced a psychotic break driven by depression and overwhelming financial stress. Her defense team argued that she was not in control of her faculties at the time and that her actions were driven by severe mental illness rather than malice. However, prosecutors presented evidence suggesting the act was premeditated revenge against her husband, carried out by harming what he held most dear. The case proceeded to a bench trial, where Judge Raymond McHugh heard all evidence. In February 2024, Judge McHugh found DiRienzo Whitehead guilty. The prosecution successfully demonstrated that despite her claims of mental illness, the evidence of planning and the nature of her actions indicated she understood what she was doing and chose to proceed. During the proceedings, DiRienzo Whitehead stated, "Only a monster would do this," seemingly expressing awareness of the heinousness of her actions. However, the prosecutor characterized the act as premeditated revenge, rather than the result of mental incapacity, emphasizing the calculated nature of her planning and execution. Judge McHugh sentenced DiRienzo Whitehead to life in prison, determining that the severity of taking a life, particularly under these circumstances, warranted the maximum penalty. The sentence reflected the court's view that regardless of financial stress or marital problems, her actions represented an unacceptable and irreversible choice that destroyed an innocent life. DiRienzo Whitehead remains incarcerated in a Pennsylvania prison, where she will spend the rest of her life. As of 2025, there have been no significant updates or appeals in her case. The following case involved law enforcement officers becoming targets during a crisis. Leslie A. Nelson. Leslie A. Nelson, a transgender woman born as Glenn Nelson, was 58 years old at the time of a major appeal in her case. She had a documented history of mental health issues that would eventually intersect with a law enforcement encounter in a devastating way. On January 28, 1995, officers from Haddon Heights, New Jersey, arrived at Nelson's residence to serve a warrant. The warrant was related to firearms violations, and officers expected to execute it as a routine matter. However, the situation rapidly escalated into something far more dangerous and tragic. What followed was a 14-hour standoff that would end with 2 officers deceased and another wounded. Nelson shot officers John Norcross and John McLaughlin, both of whom were fatally wounded. Officer Richard Norcross was also shot, but survived his injuries. The extended standoff kept the community in fear as law enforcement worked to resolve the situation and provide medical assistance to the wounded officers. The investigation following the standoff focused on understanding what had triggered such extreme actions. Forensic evidence confirmed the gunshot wounds and the circumstances of the officer's final moments. Investigators examined Nelson's mental health history and the events leading up to the warrant service, attempting to piece together what had caused the situation to spiral so catastrophically out of control. In 1997, Nelson entered a guilty plea, acknowledging responsibility for the officer's losses. Initially, she received death sentences for the acts. However, those death sentences were reversed twice on appeal, with courts finding issues with the sentencing proceedings or their application. Following the reversals, Nelson was resentenced to consecutive life terms plus 10 years. The consecutive nature of the sentences ensured that she would remain imprisoned for the rest of her natural life, even if one sentence were somehow challenged successfully. The sentence reflected the gravity of taking the lives of two law enforcement officers who were simply performing their duties. In 2016, Nelson filed another appeal challenging her sentence, but the appeal was denied. Courts found no basis to overturn the convictions or modify the sentences, determining that the lengthy appeals process had already provided ample opportunity to challenge any potential errors. The case raised questions about how law enforcement handles warrant service when mental health issues may be involved, and whether earlier interventions might have prevented the tragedy. However, the courts consistently held that regardless of mental health history, Nelson's actions in taking two lives and wounding another during a standoff warranted severe punishment. The community of Haddon Heights was forever changed by the loss of officers Norcross and McLaughlin, both of whom were remembered for their service and dedication to protecting their community. Their families endured the long legal proceedings spanning decades as appeals were filed and denied. Leslie Nelson remains incarcerated at Edna Mahan Correctional Facility, where she will spend the remainder of her life. As of 2025, there have been no significant developments or changes in her case. The consecutive life sentences ensure she will never be released, serving as a permanent consequence for the tragedy that unfolded during that January day in 1995. But some cases begin outside New Jersey's borders before finding their conclusion within its prisons. Diane Downs. Diane Downs, born August 7, 1955, in Phoenix, Arizona, came from a strict conservative family. She later alleged instances of mistreatment by her father, though she eventually recanted these claims. She was reportedly targeted for her appearance during her youth, experiences that may have shaped her psychological development. Downs married Steve Downs in 1973, later explaining she had done so partly to escape her home environment. The couple had multiple offspring together, and Downs also served as a surrogate, demonstrating what appeared to be maternal instincts. However, beneath this surface, according to later psychological evaluations, Downs possessed narcissistic, histrionic, and antisocial personality traits. The case that would define Downs' life occurred on May 19, 1983, in Oregon. On that evening, Downs was driving with 3 of her offspring when she stopped on a rural road. What happened next would shock investigators and the nation. Downs shot her offspring, resulting in the loss of 1 life and serious injuries to the other 2. One survived with paralysis, while another suffered serious medical complications that would affect them permanently. Downs initially claimed that a stranger had flagged her down and shot them during a carjacking attempt, stating, "A man shot me and my children." However, investigators immediately found her account suspicious. The details did not align with the physical evidence at the scene, and her demeanor seemed inconsistent with someone who had just witnessed such a traumatic event. The investigation revealed numerous inconsistencies in Downs' story. Forensic testing found no gunshot residue matching her account, and the pattern of injuries did not support her version of events. Investigators learned that Downs had been involved in an affair and believed her offspring were obstacles to that relationship. The turning point came when one of the surviving offspring, who had initially been unable to speak due to injuries, recovered enough to provide testimony. This testimony directly contradicted Downs' story and implicated her as the shooter. The testimony was devastating to the defense's case. In 1984, Downs was convicted and sentenced to life in prison plus 50 years. Psychological evaluations revealed that she showed no genuine remorse, viewing the offspring as obstacles rather than individuals she had harmed. In 1987, Downs escaped from prison but was recaptured, adding to her notoriety. Though the crimes occurred in Oregon, Downs was eventually transferred to Edna Mahan Correctional Facility in New Jersey, establishing her connection to the state's prison system. This transfer meant she would serve her sentence far from where the crimes occurred. On October 30th, 2025, Downs appeared before the Oregon Parole Board. During the hearing, she maintained her innocence, stating firmly, "I did not shoot my children." Despite decades behind bars, Downs has never wavered from her claim that someone else was responsible. As of late 2025, the outcome of that parole hearing remains pending. Downs currently resides at Valley State Prison in California, having been moved between various facilities over the decades. At 70 years old, she continues serving her sentence, with her continued claims of innocence falling on skeptical ears given the overwhelming evidence presented at her trial and the testimony of the surviving victim. From crimes rooted in personal obsession to those driven by simple greed, the spectrum continues. Raquel Garajao. Raquel Garajao, who was 21 years old at the time of sentencing, had been an honors student at Brookdale Community College. Her academic success seemed to promise a bright future. But beneath that surface, she was involved in a toxic relationship with Joseph Villani that involved substance use. Garajao and Villani became aware of Trupal Patel, who had success in certain business activities. They grew envious of what Patel had achieved and began plotting to rob him. What began as a robbery plan would escalate into something far more serious and permanent. On February 6, 2017, Villani and Garajao arranged to meet Patel under the pretense of a transaction. During the encounter, Villani shot Patel 3 times, causing his loss of life. Garajao's role included concealing evidence after the act, and she was later observed shopping using money stolen from Patel, showing no immediate remorse for what had occurred. Patel's body was discovered in a park, launching an immediate investigation. A witness named Tyler Yuhas agreed to cooperate with authorities, providing crucial testimony about the planning and execution of the robbery. Forensic evidence confirmed the 3 gunshot wounds, and investigators found that Villani possessed a watch stolen from Patel, creating a direct link to the crime. Investigators also uncovered text messages between Garajao and Villani that demonstrated their involvement in planning the robbery. Cell phone location data placed them at the scene, and witness statements corroborated the timeline of events. The digital evidence trail proved particularly damaging to their defense. The case went to trial, lasting 24 days as prosecutors presented their comprehensive case. In September 2018, Garajao was found guilty. Despite the overwhelming evidence against her, Garajao stated during proceedings, "I maintain my innocence," refusing to accept responsibility for her role in what had occurred. In January 2019, The court sentenced Garahao to 33 years in prison, with 30 years of parole ineligibility. This meant she would not be eligible to seek parole until 2047, by which time she would have spent the majority of her adult life behind bars. The case highlighted how greed and poor relationship choices can lead individuals down destructive paths. Gara Zhao's academic achievements and potential were overshadowed by her participation in a robbery that escalated to taking a life. As of 2025, there have been no significant updates or changes in Garahao's case. She remains incarcerated, awaiting her distant parole eligibility date, while maintaining her claims of innocence despite the evidence and jury verdict that determined otherwise. The next case involved vulnerable tourists becoming targets in a desperate situation. Antoinette Pelzer. Antoinette Pelzer, who was 46 years old at the time of sentencing, had been living without stable housing and struggled with schizophrenia. Her family confirmed her history of mental illness, noting that she had faced significant challenges managing her condition. These circumstances would intersect tragically with the lives of two tourists visiting Atlantic City. On May 21, 2012, Pelzer encountered two Canadian tourists, Po Lin Wan, who was 80 years old, and Alice Leung, who was 47 years old. The women had traveled to Atlantic City to enjoy what should have been a pleasant visit to the resort town. Instead, they became victims of a robbery that turned deadly. Pelzer approached the two women and attacked them with a butcher knife, stabbing both repeatedly during a robbery attempt. The attack was witnessed by a police officer who happened to be in the area, allowing for immediate intervention and arrest. However, despite the quick response, both Wan and Leung succumbed to their injuries. The investigation moved swiftly given the officer's direct observation of the incident. Video evidence from surveillance cameras in the area captured additional footage of the attack and Pelzer's actions. Forensic examination confirmed that a butcher knife had been used to inflict the fatal wounds, and investigators collected physical evidence linking Pelzer definitively to the scene and the victims. During interviews, Pelzer's aunt spoke to media about her niece's struggles with schizophrenia, providing context about her mental health history and the challenges she had faced. The family's statements suggested that Pelzer's untreated or inadequately treated mental illness may have contributed to her inability to make sound decisions and control her actions during the incident. Given the overwhelming evidence and the circumstances, Pelzer entered a guilty plea rather than proceeding to trial. By pleading guilty, she acknowledged her responsibility for the two losses of life. During the sentencing proceedings in 2013, Pelzer apologized to the victims' families and specifically cited her mental illness as a contributing factor to what had occurred. The court sentenced Pelzer to 80 years in prison, a sentence that effectively means she will spend the remainder of her life incarcerated. The judge considered both the severity of taking two lives and the brutal nature of the attack, balanced against the mental health factors that Pelzer's defense team presented. Ultimately, the court determined that the sentence needed to reflect the gravity of the crimes and provide justice for the victims and their families. The case drew attention to issues surrounding mental health care for individuals experiencing homelessness and the challenges of managing severe mental illness in community settings. Wan and Leung's families traveled to Atlantic City, hoping for a pleasant vacation only to become victims of a robbery driven by desperation and compounded by untreated mental illness. As of 2025, there have been no significant updates or appeals in Pelzer's case. She remains incarcerated, serving her 80-year sentence. The tragedy serves as a reminder of how mental illness, when combined with homelessness and desperation, can lead to devastating outcomes that destroy multiple lives and leave families grieving losses that could potentially have been prevented with proper mental health intervention and support systems. The final case returns to calculated planning and scientific knowledge turned toward harm. Tianlei Li. Tianlei Li, a 43-year-old chemist, had immigrated to the United States from China and built a successful career. She worked at Bristol Myers Squibb, a major pharmaceutical company, where her chemistry expertise was valued. She married Xiaoye Wang, a computer engineer, and the couple built a life together in New Jersey. However, by 2011, their marriage had become contentious, with conflicts arising over various issues. When Wang began discussing divorce, Li opposed the dissolution of their marriage strongly. Rather than accepting the end of their relationship or seeking mediation, Li began formulating a plan that would use her scientific knowledge in a deadly way. In 2011, Li began poisoning Wang with thallium, a toxic heavy metal. Thallium is a particularly insidious poison as it can be administered over time, and its symptoms can initially be mistaken for other medical conditions. Li's chemistry background gave her the knowledge to access and administer the substance in ways that might avoid immediate detection. As Wang's health deteriorated, he sought medical treatment at hospitals where physicians initially struggled to diagnose the cause of his symptoms. However, advanced hospital testing eventually revealed the presence of thallium in Wang's system. This discovery immediately raised red flags and triggered an investigation into how Wang had been exposed to such a dangerous substance. Investigators focused their attention on Li, given her access to chemicals through her work and her relationship with Wang. During questioning, Li made admissions that further implicated her in the poisoning. Forensic analysis confirmed the detection of thallium at levels consistent with deliberate poisoning rather than accidental exposure. The case went to trial, where prosecutors presented evidence of Li's motive, means, and opportunity to poison Wang. In July 2013, a jury found Li guilty of murder. The evidence demonstrated that she had used her professional expertise to carry out a calculated plan to eliminate her husband, rather than accept divorce. Li was sentenced to life in prison, reflecting the premeditated nature of the poisoning and the abuse of her scientific knowledge. Li appealed her conviction, but in 2021, the appellate court upheld both the conviction and the sentence. The appeals court found no errors in the trial proceedings that would warrant overturning the jury's verdict. The case drew significant attention due to Li's professional background and the calculated nature of using thallium as a poison. Her chemistry expertise, which should have been used to help develop treatments and improve lives, was instead weaponized against her own husband. The betrayal of professional ethics and the misuse of scientific knowledge for personal gain made the case particularly disturbing. As of 2025, there have been no significant updates or changes in Li's case. She remains incarcerated at Edna Mahan Correctional Facility, where she will serve her life sentence. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.